Welcome to All Right in Sin City, a podcast about writers and writing in the Windsor-Detroit region. Your podcasters today are
Irene Moore Davis, author, educator, and local historian.
Sarah Jarvis, former bookseller, publishing rep, and literary festival chair.
and me, Kim Conklin, Windsor-based writer and filmmaker.
Our guest today is Walter Metz. Walter Metz is a full professor in the School of Media Arts at Southern Illinois University Carbondale. He earned a Ph.D. in radio, television, film at the University of Texas at Austin in 1996 and holds an S.B. degree in materials science and engineering from MIT in 1989. He is the author of 3 books, Engaging Film Criticism, Film History, and Contemporary American Cinema, published by P. Lang, and 2 titles published by Wayne State University Press, Bewitched and Gilligan's Island. He is also the author of 60 refereed journal articles and book chapters about the intertextual relationships between film, television, novels, and theater. His work roves across disciplines, grappling with the importance of audiovisual productions for understanding such disparate subjects as gender, comedy, poetry, opera, the Cold War, the Holocaust, science, and animals. Welcome, Walter.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
It's really hard to believe that Gilligan's Island only aired for 3 seasons, 1964 to 1967, because it feels so ubiquitous. At one point in time, Gilligan's Island was the most syndicated show around the world, but few scholars have studied it, it seems. Why do you suppose that is, and what inspired you to write about Gilligan's Island?
So why it is, I know. The history of academic media studies is linked to literature. So people in the 1960s who were teaching things like Scandinavian literature discovered, oh, I could engage my students more by showing Ingmar Bergman movies. So that transition meant that film was talked about in an academic setting, but through a kind of high cultural frame. So one of the people that trained me, Horace Newcomb, was such a literary scholar. And in the 1970s, he wrote the first book of academic television studies. But largely that tradition merged with a mass communication tradition that studied things like television and radio as propaganda forms. So what we were left with was a gap where popular forms of film and television really didn't have a framework through which to be studied. So the first place I discovered this was that as a kid who loved film and television, I went to film school to learn to be a professor, and I didn't take one class where they talked about Star Wars. And for a while, I couldn't understand why this would be the case. It was the highest grossing film. It was the film that I had seen the most. And it's because of this disjunction between academic methods and high and low culture. The first breach into that was in the 1980s during the feminist revolution in academia. So things like soap operas started to be studied. But things that weren't about gender dynamics were not particularly caught up in that sort of populist wave. So a show like Gilligan's Island, with an axial cast in which the 2 female characters are stereotypes, was not going to be a good candidate for how feminist criticism engaged popular culture. That's why my prior book, Bewitched, is different than the Gilligan's Island book, because Bewitched obviously was about a central female protagonist. My interest in writing about 1960s sitcoms in general, and Gilligan's Island in particular, is that the way I do academic work, I want to figure out what's wrong with me and how television helps me figure out what's wrong with me. So I was like a really nerdy kid, and I would get beaten up at school. So I would have a crisis in the morning before I went to school, and so would watch television to keep from crying. And then I would run home right after school and watch television again as a kind of restorative kind of gesture. And of course, as a kid, I was born in 1967. So as a kid in the late 70s and the 1980s, what I did was I watched UHF television. I wasn't interested in Donahue. I watched UHF television because they had syndicated sitcom reruns. And so shows like Gilligan's Island and Bewitched were shows that by the time I got to high school, I knew far better than the things you're supposed to know in high school, like, The Great Gatsby and whatnot. So when I became a professor and started thinking about what people wrote about, the most glaring absence in television studies was Gilligan's Island, because as you say, it was virtually ubiquitous by the late 1970s. And who knows why Gilligan's Island was the most syndicated show in the world, but it was. And that's been particularly fertile. There's only 99 episodes. And so in syndication, you would watch them one at a time, 5 times a week. So that moment for people who are creating culture right now. So Seth MacFarlane is virtually the identical age that I am. And so, our generation controls the making of media content, and we also control the analysis of media content. What's really interesting about being a professor rather than the creator is that you watch this stuff recede off the back. So the thing is that after 4 generations, you're completely forgotten about. So in terms of a television show, it's much narrower than that I've gone through teaching The Simpsons, and my students don't know what that is. So teaching South Park, my students don't know what that is. Teaching Family Guy, my students don't know what that is. And now teaching BoJack Horseman, because my students do know what that is. So we're not talking about, generations of human beings, 30 years or so. We're talking about very narrow generations of every 5 years student knowledge turns over. Most importantly, in the window of my teaching, the shift from physical media to virtual media means that students don't even have access to things like DVDs and whatnot. So, I have box sets of Bewitched and Gilligan's Island. Students look at me like a relic when I come in with these strange discs. So a show like Gilligan's Island is not well circulating in streaming culture. And so the only way that students would know about it is for people to teach them. So suddenly Gilligan's Island has gone from being ubiquitous to being more like Shakespeare, like, oh, that's stuff I learned in school, which works out perfectly for my book, which is about the relationship between high literature and Gilligan's Island. But it is a crisis for the history of television that streaming services control what we know about television history. And so all of my doctoral students are in an uproar. Max just decided to pull stuff that people weren't watching. And so if it's caught in the gap where there were no DVDs anymore, those shows virtually disappear. So for example, Westworld, a show that lots of people know, was pulled from Max not too long ago. And unless you are a crazy person like me, constantly recording things, it would be very difficult to do a lecture on Westworld now because you don't have online access for it. So there's a way in which people organize television studies, and what I've just said for whatever the last 4 minutes is the various areas. Textual, like how does the show work? What's Gilligan's Island about? All the way through industrial, that is, how do you access it? And so in terms of the access part, I'm fascinated by a number of things, one of which is that my kids, having watched Gilligan's Island thousands of times, are now kind of Gilligan's Island ambassadors. They go to their friends and they're like, you cannot exist as a person without watching Gilligan's Island, and so they sit down and they show them DVDs. Um, so that's very curious that my kids and I know Gilligan's Island almost equally well. They know it because they binge watch the DVDs again and again, weekend after weekend. I know Gilligan's Island because I watched it every day for years, once a day. So under very different industrial circumstances, we sort of end up with the same outcome, which is my household is essentially a popular culture machine. If you don't know popular culture and you wander around my house, you have no idea what we're talking about. Half of it's Simpsons language, half of it's Gilligan's Island and Bewitched language. Like there are ways in which we talk in shorthand that, people who arrive from like, a British public school or something would not know a single word that we're saying.
Yeah, I can relate. I spent half of my childhood in Britain, so half of me is Doctor Who, and the other half is repeats in the 70s when we came to Canada. Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm going to quote you here and turn things just a little bit. So your quote is, while typically reviled for its episodic inanity, stupid Gilligan, yet again, keeps the castaways from being rescued. It's my contention, you write, that this narrative minimalism, how many times can Gilligan do something stupid to keep these poor people from getting rescued, is the source of the show's startling invention. Instead of imbecility, the show produces a vibrant critique of dominant American values. And I'm ending your quote here. Can you tell us a bit more about the critique of mainstream American values that Gilligan's Island offered, ironically, by stranding 7 characters on a so-called island in the Pacific?
Right. So let me start with the high culture references. So Gilligan's Island has the structure of a Beckett play. So Waiting for Godot and Gilligan's Island are more or less narratively congruent. That, you're watching Waiting for Godot and they're like, Godot's going to come at some time, and then he never comes. So Gilligan's Island is an inversion, right? Like trying to get off the island purportedly, but they aren't getting off the island. So it's a narrative about stasis, which I think fairly well describes what's wrong with perhaps humanity in general, but certainly late modernity in particular, that Waiting for Godot and Gilligan's Island are constructed within 15 years of each other. They're both sort of post-war existential texts. In philosophical terms, right, Camus' myth of Sisyphus is Gilligan's Island, right? Like they're going to push the rock up the island to get off, and they're not going to get off again. Okay, so what that invokes is that my work is cutting against the grain of most contemporary media studies, which is interested in identity politics. So the kind of transformations I'm talking about are not race, class, and gender ones. As a show about the nature of race, Gilligan's Island is a nightmare, right? The only non-white people that show up are cannibals, although they're funny cannibals. Gender, not much better. It's a show in which women are only allowed 2 channels, either Ginger, like hyper sexy, or Marianne, sort of hyper girl next door, without any kind of apparent sexual impulses. The show fares a little bit better in terms of class, right? It's a kind of class allegory in which clearly the working class people like Gilligan are far more defensible narratively than the Howells, who are rich, and particularly Mr. Howell, who's oblivious to the sufferings of the everyday people that his stock market intrigues destroying. So there's that what I'm doing is not engaging with much contemporary media criticism does, which is to figure out whether it passes the academic left's litmus test in terms of race, class, gender, or sexual identity. But I'm doing something different, which is to say that Gilligan engages in a set of maneuvers that are the foundation of American studies. So in my book, I quote R.W.B. Lewis. His famous book is The American Atom. And he argues that when people came from Europe and arrived in the New World, they were seeking rejuvenation, spiritual rejuvenation. Now, of course, this has to be footnoted with the rejuvenation was about the murder of the people that lived there. But 1960s American studies scholars were not thinking about this, and the Puritans weren't thinking about this. So what happens when folks arrive in the New World is that they see a kind of dirty, corrupt Europe being left behind, and a possibility for moral regeneration to occur. So that's the way in which the mainland is defined in the background of things like Shakespeare's The Tempest, which is purportedly set in the middle of the Mediterranean, but in fact is about Bermuda. The word Bermuda actually appears in Shakespeare's The Tempest, despite the fact that Prospero and his daughter get sent out on a boat from Italy into the Mediterranean Sea. So it's a floating signifier of what the island means in The Tempest. But, one of my arguments is that Gilligan's Island is a reconstruction of The Tempest. It's interested in an island that's not connected to a corrupt Europe. Gilligan's Island is far more radical than Shakespeare, which is a weird thing to say, because at the end of The Tempest, Prospero breaks his magic wand and they return to Europe redeemed. That is not a thing that happens, at least in the 99 episodes of Gilligan's Island. It happens later in the TV movies. But it's a show about stasis that, and the person that's keeping the stasis in place is Gilligan. That he is always the one that screws it up. He's not screwing it up on purpose, but nonetheless, he screws it up. If you asked every other castaway, do we want to go off the island? They would say, absolutely yes. If you ask Gilligan, he might say yes, because that's what he's supposed to say, but then there would be a kind of hesitation. And I think in the hesitation, that's where Gilligan's status as the American Atom lies, that he's far more comfortable on the island than anyone else. One of the crucial episodes in my book is called The Beauty Contest. And so the castaways, for reasons that are just opaque, decide to have a beauty contest. So the three women, Ginger, Marian, and Mrs. Howell, are promoted by three of the men. So Mr. Howell wants Mrs. Howell to win, and the skipper wants Ginger to win, and the professor wants Marianne to win. And they're just diabolically evil. They're constantly, the men are sabotaging the other contests in the beauty contest. So in the middle of the episode, they say, Gilligan, you have to judge the beauty contest. And he's like, I don't want to do that. They're like, you have to, you're the only person left. So in the B plot of that episode, Gilligan has been talking to his ape friend from the island, Gladys. And every time the castaways do something horrible to each other, Gilligan bemoans to Gladys, why are these people so awful? So at the end, after the guys have ruined each other's women's performance on the stage, they all turn to Gilligan and they say, well, who won? And he's like, well, you said to me that the island's beauty contest would be about natural beauty. So here's the winner, Gladys the ape. And that is Gilligan at his theoretical best. That not only does he get himself out of the interpersonal crisis of having to pick one friend over the other, he defends a kind of sense that the island can be a place away from corruption. And the other castaways, don't throw him into the volcano. They're like, oh yeah, he taught us something. That is what Lewis argues the American Adam teaches European civilization, that a moral system can be redeemed. And that's why American exceptionalism was the centerpiece of American studies, that there was something wrong with Europe that led to 2 world wars. And there was something different about the United States because it was the force that produced the Marshall Plan. Like, Europeans would never produce the Marshall Plan, right? Okay. So now we have to skip from that theoretical frame to what's happening in the 1960s. So we're not quite to 1968 when the world's on fire, but we're right on the threshold of it, right? Gilligan's Island ran from 1964 to 1967. And so the mainland is what's corrupt, right? It's the world in which, Richard Nixon was the vice president of the United States. And it's a world that would very quickly dismantle Kennedy's Camelot in favor of a person like Richard Nixon. So the mainland of the United States is now what's corrupt. That is, it's replicating what Europe meant to the Puritans, which leaves 2 symbolic spaces, Hawaii and Alaska. And Gilligan's Island's choice, Schwartz's choice is, I want something that's connected to the United States, but that's separated from it. So that is the genius of Gilligan's Island. It takes a place in the South Pacific, and it imagines itself as the inversion of the corrupt mainland. And Gilligan is the owner of that show because he's the only one with the good sense of screwing everything up so they can't get back there, because everything that goes back there gets ruined. And so if you're interested in television history, one of the primary influences of Gilligan's Island on contemporary television is Northern Exposure, which instead of using Hawaii uses Alaska. And Northern Exposure, by Brandon Falsey, the people that made Sin Elsewhere, these are people that revolutionize what we call quality television, where you wouldn't have to do my theatrical gymnastics to say how important Gilligan's Island is. Contemporary scholars are like, oh yeah, Northern Exposure, really smart show. But its maneuvers, my favorite of which is that Ruth Ann, who runs the grocery store, says, oh, my son is coming from the mainland. And they're like, oh, that's great. She's like, oh no, I'm so embarrassed. And the rest of the people in Sicily are like, well, why is that? She's like, oh, he's a stockbroker. So that's the inversion of Gilligan's Island. In Northern Exposure made much more explicit. But so many of the gestures that Northern Exposure is making about its relationship to the mainland is what Gilligan's Island had been making since the 1960s. So that's some of what's at stake in the refusal of leaving the island in Gilligan's Island.
You've mentioned Beckett's Waiting for Godot and Shakespeare's The Tempest as some of the literary traditions that Gilligan's Island drew inspiration from. Are there any other important ones to mention? And how was the show different from anything people had seen before?
Right. So I'm not sure it's all that different from things that people had seen before. I mean, it's certainly a show that leaned into seeming inanity, that was able to produce a lot of social force because of how inane it seemed. So, I don't know, the pill that is hidden in the sugar or something. Sherwood Schwartz is one of the great geniuses of American television, that Here's a guy who wanted to be a biologist, fought in World War II, and is like, well, screw that, I'm going to do something important. So he started writing comedy. I think anyone who lives in a world like this, who's not writing, performing, and or analyzing comedy, might not be paying enough attention. That'd be one thing I would say. So yeah, Schwartz is engaged in figuring out how he's going to take the great literary tradition. He was a literature major in college. So yeah, you've got a set of literary texts that are just hovering beneath the surface of Gilligan's Island. I mean, the answer to your question is there are dozens. In my book on film criticism, I talk about the difference between a referential intertext and an imaginative intertext. So a referential intertext is something that works at the level of things that we would normally refer to as intention or something. Like when you watch it, you're like, oh, I see what the producers are doing is they're reworking this kind of text, right? And then when it's one of my interventions that I think we should use Sisyphus as a way of understanding Gilligan's Island. That's probably an imaginative intertext. I'm using that as a method to crack something open in the show, but it's unlikely that there's much textual or archival evidence to say Sherwood Schwartz was sitting down thinking about Camus. All right, so the interesting part of being a critic is that once you define a structure like that, there's all kinds of stuff that falls in the middle. So that's what my students that I was arguing about, like how referential are some of the things that I'm doing. So we'll start with the things that are highly referential. One of the innovations of Gilligan's Island is that it relies on dream sequences to get off the island. So a whole set of literature is adapted in short 7-minute segments where Gilligan has a dream. So there's a Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, there's a Frankenstein, and there's a Dracula. I think there's 7 of those dream sequences, but all 3 of those would not exist without the literary stuff in front of them. The best episode of Gilligan's Island, the episode that most fans remember, and the episodes that other academics have tended to talk about by not even bothering to talk about Gilligan's Island, is called The Producer. It's where Phil Silvers, a Broadway producer, lands on the island. And the castaways put on a musical version of Hamlet so that he'll take them all back to Broadway so they can put on this musical version of Hamlet. And, you know, because he's from the corrupt mainland, he steals their idea, doesn't rescue them, and then launches the Broadway version of the musical Hamlet. So that is highly referential, as opposed to The Tempest, which I think is in many ways the thematic spine of Gilligan's Island, is probably more imaginative than referential. So all the existential literature lurks in the back. Moby Dick as a kind of central example of R.W. Lewis's The American Adam, right? Ishmael is the American Adam, and Gilligan is the American Adam. At a particular moment in the book, I'm interested in the various kinds of formats of literature that the show's engaging. So I think on the short story front, the most referential maneuver an episode makes, that episode is called The Hunter. Rory Calhoun plays a hunter who arrives on the island who hunts human beings. He hunts Gilligan. So The Most Dangerous Game, you know, famous anthologized short story, lurks there fairly aggressively. In my mind, I tend not to make much distinction between fiction literature and nonfiction stuff. So I think Gilligan's Island is a virtual emplotment of Irving Goffman's sociological work from the late 50s, the presentation of self in everyday life. Of the 99 episodes of Gilligan's Island, 33 are about performance, putting on a show. That is a stunningly large number for those of us who live in the real world. for people that work in Hollywood, that's not so out of whack. Um, I'm really interested in theories of comedy. So um, Mikhail Bakhtin's book on Francois Rabelais, I think the notion of the carnivalesque haunts all comedy, but it haunts particular moments of Gilligan's Island as well. So Rabelais' Gargantuan Pantagruel, that's the quintessential French Renaissance comic novel, hangs around a lot. So the point of it is that the more you get me thinking, the more literary texts that I'll come up with. But those are the ones that, off the top of my head, structure the book that I wrote.
Well, it is a very fascinating book. Are you working on any new writing now?
Yeah, so the most important thing I'm working on right now relevant to this is that for about the last year, I was watching a lot of Columbo from the 1970s. And what happens to me is that as things get bad in the world, I retreat into strange worlds of the past. So I'll go to bed with my iPad open and we'll watch things to fall asleep with. When I know them well enough that I don't have to see them, I'll put the iPad down and just listen. So I was getting to the moment in Columbo where we already know who the killer was and just listening to Peter Falk's voice as I went to sleep. And I had been doing this for months. And then I started flitting around Peacock and I noticed that um, they were pushing Columbo. So at first I thought they were pushing Columbo just to me because of my usage, the streaming usage, but it turned out they were pushing Columbo to other people. And so Columbo has achieved a sort of resurgence that one would not predict, right? Culture is unpredictable in many ways, and that's one of the things. If you asked me 2 years ago, of all the things from the 1970s, what's going to become important? And people said Columbo, I'd be like, well, it's a great show, but I don't know why that over another 1,000 different shows. So then I discovered why Peacock was doing it. They were releasing the show Poker Face with Natasha Lyonne, and Poker Face is a reconstruction of Columbo, that its credit sequence is designed with the same typeface as Columbo. Natasha Lyonne plays this kind of clairvoyant poker player. That's what's called Poker Face. And she's been banned from every casino because she knows when people are telling the truth or not, the way Columbo used to know about these rich murderers that he was interrogating. And then the third episode of Poker Face is a reconstruction of the best episode of Columbo, which is called Any Old Port in a Storm. So then I'm like, oh, this is interesting. What does it mean that the male detective that Peter Falk played is being reconstructed as a female investigator? And then I started watching my favorite show that's on the air right now, CBS's Elsbeth. And Elsbeth is also a Columbo reconstruction. And so now you got two shows that make the same maneuver, replacing Peter Falk's ratiocination with women detectives. And that got me rolling on the project. I'm really interested when trends start to develop and why they would develop. Poker Face is in many ways the easier one to write about because it's Rian Johnson, the Knives Out guy. So Rian Johnson has already interested in reconstructing for the contemporary moment the history of audiovisual ratiocination. Right, Knives Out is kind of like a weird Agatha Christie reconstruction. But Elsbeth is Trixie, that Michelle and Robert King, they're the showrunners for The Good Place, no, for The Good Wife and Evil. Showrun Elsbeth. So you think it's a procedural that's just the same as any of these kinds of NCIS kind of things that run thousands of episodes. But in fact, its 10 episodes are incredibly focused reconstructions of what Columbo's up to. Columbo's an astonishing show from the 70s because it's so sort of social Marxist in its orientation that the people that commit the murders are always rich people. And Elsbeth works this way, that the people that she investigates, because it's a show that's really interested in television genre, so she goes after a reality show host in one episode, a theatrical director in another episode. She's really interested in taking down the cultural intelligentsia in New York where she works. So that is the essay that I'm writing right now. I'm going to deliver it at the Literature Film Association conference in the fall. I'm about to retire, so there's other like life works that I've got sort of hanging around. By the second half of my career 20 years ago, I started noticing that there were all kinds of ways that film school taught film production students incorrectly. One of which is that in film studies, we teach feature-length things, and students make short films. And so when students would say, hey, will you read my script? I'd be like, sure. And I would read it. It'd be 10 pages long, so look like a short film, but in fact, they were writing a feature. And I kept saying, well, you shouldn't be writing features. And they're like, what do you mean? I'm like, well, this is a really good 10 pages, but it's got to be in 30 pages because you're doing all kinds of character development. It can't be a 10-minute movie. And so I started teaching this course called Short Cinema Studies. It basically made the students read all kinds of short stories, watch all kinds of one-act plays, read all kinds of short format lyric poetry. And I'm like, this is the stuff that you should know if you're going to write a short film. The fact that me and one other person, Richard Raskin, in Europe, is the most highly published person about short format film. The fact there's only 2 people in the world that like noticed that maybe we shouldn't teach long format narrative to students who are asked to make 5-minute movies. So I have a textbook about this that I'm, writing. Whether I'll finish it or not is a different story. So one of the things I really loved about the TV Milestones books that I wrote for Wayne State, both Bewitched and Gilligan's Island, they can only be 100 pages long. So I can get in and out that real fast. One of the reasons I have 60 refereed articles is I can get out of that in a weekend to write a big book like my engaging film criticism book. That takes many years and it requires a brain far more focused than mine. So it could be things like the essay on Columbo and Poker Face will be the last kind of things that I publish. I hope not, but with the collapse of public higher education in the United States, I'm not overly convinced that's going to be the case. My friends call me a curmudgeon, and that's a curmudgeonly thing that I say. I'm not sure public higher education, the humanities in the United States can be rescued. I certainly have spent 35 years trying to rescue it, and I don't think I've made any progress. In fact, it might have gotten worse. But it is a great joy to get to talk with students about things like Gilligan's Island, because essentially you're like an ad exec, right? Like, hey, you're going to like this show. And they're like, no, I'm not. And they watch the show and they're like, yeah, I really like that show. So that is rewarding sort of in a much more narrow sense.
Would you like to read for our listeners?
Sure, absolutely. So I'll read from the Tempest section. The basic familial dynamics of the Tempest are replicated in Gilligan's Island. Prospero's paternal relationship to innocent Miranda is mimicked in the professor and skipper's protection of the virginal Marianne. The knife Gilligan, the classical American Adam studied by R.W.B. Lewis and Leo Marx, is an asexual version of Caliban, Shakespeare's native islander. In The American Adam, Lewis argues that American exceptionalism is built on American culture's embrace of the European immigrants' new land and his escape from the corruption and confines of Europe. Lewis proposes that American literature celebrates the flourishing of an innocent, such as Huckleberry Finn, in a new land and laments the fall of those who have lost their Adamic innocence, such as Jay Gatsby. Classical American studies of the 1960s fully imbues Gilligan's Island. The show is a fellow traveler with Lewis and Marx who argue for American exceptionalism via the well-meaning yet simple folks who populate our literary culture. While Marx begins the machine in the garden with the astonishing claim that The Tempest is the first piece of American literature, Gilligan's Island seems to cap the trajectory of that experience as its apotheosis, producing a renewed televised Tempest at precisely the time Marx's book advances the academic cause of American studies. The book was published the same year as the Gilligan's pilot aired. The Tempest exists within a chain of Renaissance utopian philosophy. Within the play, the elderly counselor Gonzalo expresses the desire of Europeans to escape the Machiavellian corruption of their political lives. When first thinking about the island, Gonzalo delivers a paean to the possibilities utopia. In the Commonwealth, I would by contraries execute all things, for no kind of traffic would I admit, no name of magistrate, letters should not be known, riches, poverty, and use of service none, contract, succession, born, bound of land, tithe, vineyard none, no use of metal, corn, or wine, or oil, no occupation, all men idle all, and women too, but innocent and pure, no sovereignty. Yet undermining this vision are characters both powerful, Alonso and Sebastian, and comic, Stefano and Trinculo, who only have their own petty interests at heart. Many Gilligan's Island episodes are built around the very same constraint on the possibility of utopia. The steady state of the series is utopian. The castaways live off the resources of the island. It is only the narrative demand for drama to produce the temporary conflicts of the 23-minute episodes which intrude on the utopian experience. In episode after episode, a scheme arises that shakes the castaways out of Gonzalo's utopian reverie. Someone questions who's the most beautiful woman on the island, thus pitting the men and women against each other. A radio report informs the castaways that one among their number is a murderer. In Gilligan Goes Gung-Ho, the castaways live peacefully until a law book washes up on the shore. The castaways become convinced that they are immediately going to become the victims of crime, despite the fact that they have been living peacefully without incident for 3 years. Once a botched election for sheriff places Gilligan in charge, the young lad sees crime in every castaway's behavior, resulting in the arrest of all the castaways. In no episode is the Shakespearean disruption of the utopian more prominent than in President Gilligan. To survive, the professor and skipper are digging a well. The professor wants to help dig, but the Howells have the lad building their private estate. The skipper and Mr. Howell fight over Gilligan's labor. The skipper says, as captain of the boat, he's in charge of the island. As a business tycoon, Mr. Howell insists he is the chairman of the board and therefore outranks the skipper. A scientist, the professor observes that no one in charge of the island. To resolve the conflict democratically, Ginger comes up with the idea of having an election for president. In Act 1, each of the candidates, the skipper and Mr. Howell, behave as corruptly as did their Shakespearean predecessors, Alonso and Sebastian, who scheme to exile Prospero from Italy, and Stefano and Trinculo, who plot with Caliban to murder Prospero when on the island. Mr. Howell tries to bribe Marian and Ginger to woo their votes. He tells Ginger he will buy Hollywood for her. Then Ginger, working for Mr. Howell, goes to seduce Gilligan. She tries to kiss him, but the nymph is unprepared for her sexuality and knocks himself out against a tree. She looks into the camera and shrugs. Mr. Howell then tries to bribe Gilligan by promising to make him Secretary of the Navy. In an uncanny prediction of Survivor, CBS's reality show from 2000 to the present, yet in a utopian way that sociologically binds us rather than divides us, the professor invents an election booth on the primitive island. The professor counts the votes. 2 votes for Mr. Howell, 2 votes for Skipper. There's a write-in vote for Gilligan by Mrs. Howell, and then another for Gilligan from Marianne. The 3rd vote is for Gilligan. Act 2 thus begins with Gilligan having been elected president because scheming and bribery backfired against Mr. Howell and the skipper. But not having learned his lesson, Mr. Howell again comes to bribe Gilligan. The skipper also has learned nothing, insisting he's the vice president because of his close relationship with his little buddy. Mr. Howell appoints himself Chief Justice of the Supreme Court because he has been arrested 6 times for antitrust violations. For his part, Gilligan tries his best as the new leader. He gives a speech during dinner insisting that they pitch in to dig a well. But Gilligan has no authority. They all ignore him. Throughout the rest of the episode, Gilligan tries to get the well dug. He again tries to get the skipper to pay attention to their survival needs, but the greedy sailor is more interested in a new hut that befits his role as vice president. Finally, Gilligan takes the government into his own hands. He digs the well himself as the others stand and argue. Refusing to grant Gilligan any authority whatsoever, none of the castaways believe there's any water there, so Gilligan quits. As he drives his shovel into the hole in disgust, he hits water. The episode's coda returns the narrative to the status quo. Gilligan has a new rescue plan. He proposes that they build a lookout tower to spot passing ships. However, all the other castaways make excuses to again not help him. Unlike Gilligan's Island, Shakespeare's The Tempest begins with tragedy looming. Prospero summons the Tempest in order that his enemies stand before him to face his judgment. However, because of the comic mask in Act 4 celebrating the marriage of Prospero's daughter Miranda to Alonso's son Ferdinand, the familial bonds heal the wounds of the past. The Tempest ends comically with the schemes diffused of danger and all setting sail to return to Italy. So too does Gilligan's Island diffuse real danger. Whenever a nefarious visitor arrives on the island, Gilligan, through luck or pluck, wins the day. When the hunter, after human game, is about to shoot Gilligan, the boy hides in a tree trunk, comically moving the object out of the rifle sights each time it's aimed at his heart. Just as Gilligan is about to be killed, the hunter's watch timer goes off, indicating that Gilligan has won the battle between predator and prey. In short, Gilligan's Island is one of the most Shakespearean texts in the history of American television. While Shakespearean scholars have rightly emphasized the wonders of the musical version of Hamlet in the episode The Producer, it is my belief that the more pressing Shakespearean intertext, because of its engagement with an American utopia, is The Tempest.
Excellent. We've been discussing Gilligan's Island, a fascinating and delightful book in the TV Milestones series published by Wayne State University with author Walter Metz. Thanks so much for joining us, Walter.
Thanks so much for having me.
Thanks for joining us. Look for more episodes of All Right in Sin City wherever you listen to podcasts, or check out our website, allrightinsincity.com. For information and announcements of new podcasts, sign up to our email list or follow us on Facebook and Twitter.